The fog over Thornbury Hills, Virginia, was the kind that swallowed sound. It rolled low across the manicured lawns and settled into the gutters like a living thing, thick enough to blur the glow of the street lamps into soft amber halos. This was old money country, the kind of neighborhood where the hedges were trimmed with surgical precision and the security gates hummed quietly behind wrought iron fences, where a house didn't just cost money, it cost pedigree. For Brigadier General Naomi Castellan, this neighborhood was the only place on earth where she didn't have to be anyone's commanding officer. 26 years in the United States Army had taken her through 2 combat tours, a punishing stretch at the Pentagon, and now a seat at the table, advising the Joint Chiefs of Staff on global logistics. She had briefed 4-star generals without blinking. She had stood in rooms where a wrong word could move troops across an ocean. But here, on Birchwood Lane, at 5:15 in the morning, she was just a 51-year-old woman lacing up her running shoes before the sun came up. She wore what she always wore on these runs, a faded gray West Point sweatshirt gone soft with age, black leggings, a knit beanie pulled low over her ears against the October chill. No insignia, no stars, no armor of rank, just a woman and the sound of her own breath in the cold morning air. She had no idea that 2 men in a patrol car were about to make the worst decision of their lives. Officer Wade Corrigan had been on the Thornbury Hills police force for 16 years, and somewhere in that decade and a half, something in him had curdled. He wasn't the only cop who'd let cynicism harden into something uglier, but he wore it more openly than most. A swagger that mistook suspicion for instinct and instinct for the law. Beside him in the passenger seat sat Officer Tyler Reeves, 5 months out of the academy, still soft around the edges, still under the impression that badges meant something clean. "Slow down, 6," Corrigan muttered, easing off the gas as their headlights swept over a jogger's silhouette moving along the sidewalk. "Look at that." Reeves glanced up from the dash terminal. "Look at what? We don't have a call, don't need one." Corrigan's eyes narrowed, tracking the figure through the mist. "That's not right. That's a woman jogging, Wade. At this hour? In this neighborhood." Hoodie pulled up, face half covered. Corrigan's mouth twisted into something between a smirk and a sneer. "We had those garage break-ins 2 streets over last month. Somebody casing houses would dress exactly like that. She's running, man. Not walking around peeking in windows. You let me handle the policing, kid." He hit the gas, swinging the cruiser sharply until it clipped the curb ahead of her, headlights flooding her path. Naomi's pulse, steady at a controlled 130 beats per minute. Her mind, halfway through mentally reorganizing a supply chain briefing, spiked as the light hit her square in the face. She threw a hand up, shoes skidding against wet pavement. Corrigan was out of the car before it had fully stopped, one hand resting on his belt with the practiced menace of a man who liked being the biggest thing in a room. "Hold it right there." Naomi went still. Decades of discipline settled over her like a second skin, breath slowing, shoulders squaring, eyes cataloging the scene the way she'd once cataloged a hostile checkpoint. 2 officers, one aggressive, one hanging back and unsure, a spotlight meant to disorient, not illuminate. "Good morning, officer," she said, and her voice came out level, unshaken. "Is there a problem?" I asked the questions. Corrigan advanced, closing the distance until he was standing far too close. "Where are you coming from?" "My home. About 2 miles that way. I'm finishing a loop." "Your home." He repeated it slow, dragging the word through something thick and ugly. His eyes moved over her. The worn sweatshirt, the beanie, her skin, and something in his expression curdled further. "You live around here?" "I do. 418 Birchwood Lane. That's a $3.5 million property." Corrigan took another step, close enough now that she could smell his coffee breath. "And you're telling me you own it?" Her jaw tightened, but her voice didn't. "I'm not going to justify my finances to you on a public sidewalk. I've broken no laws. If you're not detaining me, I'm continuing my run." She stepped to go around the cruiser. Corrigan's hand shot out and closed around her forearm. "I didn't say you were dismissed, Wade." Reeves had climbed out of the car now, his voice tight with a nervousness that hadn't yet curdled into complicity. "Maybe we should just quiet." Corrigan didn't even look at him. His grip tightened on Naomi's arm. "I need to see identification. Now." "I have no identification on me. I have a house key tied into my shoelace and a phone in this armband. That's all." "Of course you don't." Corrigan's smile was ugly and triumphant, wandering around a rich neighborhood before sunrise with no ID, claiming you own a mansion. Hands on the hood. Something old and cold moved through Naomi's chest. Not fear, never fear, but a fury so controlled it felt like ice. "In." The Pentagon colonels waited for her to finish a sentence before they spoke. Here, a beat cop with 15 years of unchecked ego was trying to bend her over the hood of a patrol car. "Officer," she said, and her voice dropped an octave, carrying a weight that made even Reeves flinch. "You do not have reasonable suspicion to detain me. This state has no stop and identify statute absent an arrest. I've given you my address. I'm going home." For half a second, something flickered behind Corrigan's eyes, the unfamiliar sensation of being spoken to like a subordinate. Then his pride swallowed it whole. "Are you refusing a lawful order?" "It isn't a lawful order." He grabbed her. Hard. Hard enough to bruise. And in that instant, every reflex his years of training had built into her body screamed to act. She could see, with total clarity, the exact leverage point that would put him on the pavement with a dislocated shoulder before Reeves could clear his holster. But the general in her overruled the soldier. She would not become a headline. She would not hand him a justification. She went limp. Let him twist her arm behind her back. Let the cuffs bite into skin already darkening with bruises. "She's resisting." Corrigan barked to Reeves, a lie manufactured on the spot, tested in real time to see if it would hold. "I am completely compliant," Naomi said, loud enough to carry down the block. "I am not resisting. This is excessive force." Across the street, a porch light flicked on. An older man in a bathrobe, Harold Callahan, a retired appellate judge who'd lived 3 houses down for a decade, stepped out to grab his newspaper and froze at the sight unfolding on the sidewalk. "Hey!" he shouted, clutching his robe. "What in God's name are you doing to her?" "That's my neighbor." Corrigan didn't even glance over. "Police business, sir. Get back inside. That's General Castellan. I've had dinner at her house." The words evaporated into the fog, unheard or unheeded. Corrigan shoved Naomi toward the cruiser, folding her into the back seat with a rough hand on the crown of her head. The door slammed. The cage of wire mesh separated her from the front seat, from the 2 men who had just detonated the first charge in the collapse of their own lives, though neither of them knew it yet. The drive to the Ridgeview Division precinct took 18 minutes. Naomi sat upright the entire way, refusing the cushion of the seat back, her wrists throbbing with every pothole. Up front, the dynamic between the 2 officers was already fracturing. Wade, that guy on the porch, he called her General. He knew her name. People lie for their friends. What if she really does live there? We didn't run her name before we cuffed her. We didn't do any of this by the book. The book's a guideline, kid. Out here you go with your gut, and my gut says she's trouble. Naomi said nothing. She simply watched the back of his head and thought of an old lesson she'd once taught to young officers at the War College. Never interrupt an enemy while he's making a mistake. Corrigan was making several, methodically, one after another, and she intended to let him finish digging before the ground gave way beneath him. The Ridgeview precinct at 6 in the morning was a fluorescent lit hive of noise, phones ringing, keyboards clattering, the low murmur of a dozen overlapping conversations. At the booking counter sat Desk Sergeant Earl Boyle, a heavy-set man nursing his 3rd cup of burnt coffee. "What we got, Corrigan?" "Prowler." refused to ID, resisted arrest. Corrigan slapped Naomi's confiscated phone onto the counter like a trophy, caught her casing houses on Birchwood. Boyle looked up at the woman standing calm and upright before him, no tremor in her hands, no tears, no panic, and something about the stillness made the hair on his arms rise, though he couldn't have said why. Name? Naomi Castellan. Date of birth? She gave it. Address? 418 Birchwood Lane, Thornbury Hills. Her voice carried clean across the bullpen. A few heads turned. Corrigan laughed, sharp and mocking. Yeah, right. Write down transient, Sarge. She's delusional. I am stating my legal residence for the record, Naomi said, fixing Boyle with a look that made him shift in his chair without understanding why. I'd suggest you record it accurately. Boyle wrote it down exactly as she said it. Some instinct in him already sensing that whatever was happening here, it was bigger than a Tuesday morning arrest. They stripped her shoelaces, her beanie, her house key. Corrigan hauled her down a narrow, ammonia-smelling hallway and shoved her into a holding cell. Get comfortable, he sneered. You're going to be here a while. I am entitled to a phone call. You'll get it. Eventually. Depends how cooperative you feel like being. He turned and walked off, laughing to himself, and Naomi lowered herself onto the cold concrete bench, closed her eyes, and waited. Not with despair, but with the patience of a woman who had once waited 72 hours in a foxhole for an extraction that finally came. She thought of her grandfather, who had marched through violence in his youth, so that she would never have to. She thought of the soldiers she had sent into danger to protect freedoms that had just been stripped from her on a quiet residential street. They thought they'd arrested a nobody. They had no idea they'd just locked up the Deputy Director of Strategic Logistics for the Armed Forces of the United States, and that within the hour, the full and merciless weight of the federal government would come crashing down on this precinct like a demolition ball. Sergeant Boyle ran her fingerprints through the automated fingerprint identification system, syncing with the FBI's national database. Expecting nothing more than a routine hit or a clean record, the screen went black. A blinding red banner slammed across the monitor. An alarm tone he'd never heard in 22 years on the job shrieked 3 times. Critical alerts, top secret psi clearance, subsact. Castellan, Naomi R., active duty flag officer, immediate release, proabide without DOD verification. Contact Pentagon Command Center immediately. Boyle's coffee cup crumpled in his fist, scalding liquid spilling unnoticed over his knuckles. Corrigan, he said, voice cracking. Corrigan, get over here. She got warrants? Corrigan strolled over, grinning, entirely unprepared for what was about to detonate his world. You absolute. Look at the screen. Boyle's finger shook as he pointed. Flag officer. Do you understand what that means? That's a general, Corrigan. You arrested a general. Officer Reeves, at a nearby desk, dropped his pen. It clattered across the floor in the sudden, ringing silence. It's a glitch, Corrigan said, though the color was already draining from his face. Some kind of mistake. Identity theft. There's no way a woman jogging in a hoodie at 5 a.m. is a... Boyle wasn't listening anymore. He ripped open the evidence bag, pulled out the government issue phone, and half ran down the corridor to the holding cell. Hands shaking so badly, he fumbled the slot twice before sliding the device through the bars. Your call, ma'am, General. Naomi rose, unhurried, and took the phone. Thank you, Sergeant. I take it my prints have cleared. Yes, ma'am. I apologize for the delay. The delay, she said evenly, is the least of what this precinct has to apologize for. She dialed a 10-digit secure line from memory, 3 rings. National Military Command Center, Major Ferris speaking. This is Brigadier General Naomi Castellan. Authentication code Delta Whiskey 61 Tango. Authentication confirmed, General. Go ahead, ma'am. Patch me through to Lieutenant General Marcus Holloway. Priority. A click, a beat of static, and then a deep, graveled voice filled the line. Naomi, It's 6:30 in the morning. What's the situation? Marcus, I have a tactical disruption. I'm currently detained in holding Cell 3 of the Ridgeview Division Precinct in Thornbury Hills. I was cuffed and transported from outside my own residence during my morning run. The silence on the other end stretched 3 full seconds. Say that again. I was detained without cause, handcuffed, and booked on fabricated charges. Bruised wrists, nothing worse. But my patience has run out. Who, Holloway said, and his voice had dropped into something low and dangerous, put hands on you? Officer Wade Corrigan. His partner, Officer Tyler Reeves, was present, but did not initiate. Sit tight, Naomi. You're about to see the entire weight of the Department of Defense land on that building within the hour. I'm sending Colonel Rourke from CID and Federal Counsel. 20 minutes. Understood. Castellan out. She ended the call and turned to Boyle, who stood frozen at the bars like a man watching his own execution approach on schedule. Sergeant, I'd recommend you call your captain. He's going to want to be conscious for what's coming. Captain Gerald Whitmore was standing in his kitchen, in sweatpants, pouring cereal when his phone rang. Not the precinct line, but the direct number of the chief of police. Gerald, what in the hell is happening at your precinct? The chief's voice tore through the receiver. I just got a call from the mayor, who got a call from the governor, who got woken up by the Secretary of Defense himself. Whitmore's spoon hit the floor. The Secretary of Defense, sir? One of your officers arrested a Pentagon general jogging in her own neighborhood and booked her like a common trespasser. Army CID is mobilizing. The FBI field office is en route. The DOJ is drafting civil rights charges as we speak. You have 10 minutes to get to that precinct and start praying. The line went dead. Whitmore didn't bother changing. He grabbed his badge and drove 90 miles an hour down the interstate, with his hazards flashing, his stomach in knots the entire way. Back at the precinct, panic had metastasized into full-blown chaos. Corrigan's fabricated charges were already coming apart under basic scrutiny. A woman jogging in her own neighborhood provided no reasonable suspicion of anything. Virginia had no stop and identify statute triggering an arrest, and the claim of resisting arrest would collapse the instant anyone reviewed the dashcam. Corrigan paced the bullpen, chewing his thumbnail raw, muttering to anyone who'd listen that it had to be some kind of scam, a fake database entry, a sovereign citizen with a hacked federal record. Reeves sat hunched at his desk, head in hands, silently shaking. At exactly 7:02, the precinct's glass doors didn't open so much as get shouldered aside. 3 black armored Suburbans jumped the curb and parked directly across the plaza. 6 figures stepped out, 4 heavily built men in tactical gear, with CD stitched across their backs in stark yellow, flanked by Colonel Ellis Rourke, a man whose face looked carved from granite, and Vivian Cross, a razor-precise federal attorney representing the Department of Defense. The bullpen went dead silent. Phones rang unanswered. Rourke marched straight to the booking desk, his voice booming loud enough to rattle the ceiling tiles. Colonel Ellis Rourke, United States Army Criminal Investigation Division. Where is Brigadier General Castellan? Captain Whitmore, arriving 2 minutes prior and still gasping for breath, stumbled out of his office. Colonel, I am so deeply sorry. Save the apology for the congressional hearing. Vivian Cross cut in, dropping a heavy leather case onto the counter, with a thud that echoed like a gavel. You are illegally holding a senior military officer with a top-secret clearance. Under Title 18, Section 1201, absent any lawful jurisdiction, this constitutes a federal kidnapping. Whitmore went white. Kidnapping? Now hold on, my officer believed. I don't care what your officer believed, Rourke snarled. Open that cell. Now. Corrigan, clinging to the last shreds of his authority like a drowning man to driftwood, stepped forward. Hold on a second. I'm the arresting officer here. She refused to identify. Rourke turned his gaze on him. a look that had once silenced hardened combatants in war zones without a single raised voice. "Are you Officer Wade Corrigan?" "Yeah, I am. You are a disgrace to that uniform." Rourke's voice dropped to something quiet and lethal. "You profiled, assaulted, and falsely imprisoned a decorated flag officer who has done more for this country before sunrise than you will accomplish in your entire miserable career. Turn around, hands behind your back." Corrigan blinked, stunned. "You can't. I'm a cop. You can't just—" "You're a civil rights violator who just triggered a federal incident," Cross corrected coldly. "The Department of Justice has authorized your immediate detainment, pending federal charges for deprivation of rights under color of law." 2 CID agents seized Corrigan by the arms. The irony landed on the room like a physical weight. Less than 2 hours earlier, he'd been the one snapping cuffs onto an innocent woman on a public sidewalk. Now his own wrists were wrenched together behind his back, the click of the cuffs echoing through a bullpen, gone completely, suffocatingly silent. Reeves, watching from his desk, stood without being told and put his own hands behind his back before anyone had to ask. The procession, Boyle, Whitmore, Rourke, Cross, walked the ammonia-scented corridor to holding cell 3. Boyle's hands shook so badly, he dropped the keys twice before the tumblers finally turned and the heavy door swung open. Naomi Castellan stood in the center of the cell, exactly as she had been left, spine straight, expression unreadable, looking less like a woman who'd just been released from unlawful detention, and more like a commanding officer inspecting the aftermath of a battle she'd already won. Colonel Rourke snapped a crisp salute. "General Castellan, perimeter secure. Your transport is waiting." She returned it flawlessly. "Thank you, Colonel." She walked out past Captain Whitmore without so much as a glance, out into the bullpen where every officer in the room rose from their desks. Some out of respect, most out of sheer terror. She paused beside the booking counter, where Corrigan now stood in handcuffs, his face the color of ash, his eyes wide with the dawning comprehension of a life about to be dismantled beam by beam. She didn't gloat. She didn't raise her voice. The silence she carried was heavier than any insult she could have hurled. "I told you, Officer Corrigan," she said quietly, the words somehow filling the entire room. "You were making a catastrophic mistake." Had. She turned and walked through the shattered doors into the rising sun, leaving the wreckage of his career smoldering behind her. But the silence she left behind wasn't peace. It was the ringing quiet after an explosion. Through the broken glass doors, the remaining officers watched the black Suburbans pull smoothly away, merging into morning traffic and vanishing toward Washington. They had taken the general. They had left a nightmare in her place. Before Captain Whitmore could even draw breath to speak, sirens tore through the morning air. Not local sirens, but the multi-tonal wail of federal vehicles. 4 dark explorers swerved into the lot, boxing in every remaining cruiser. A dozen agents in Navy windbreakers, stamped with FBI in bold yellow letters, swarmed the entrance, led by Special Agent Renata Sloan, a veteran of the Civil Rights Division, with a reputation for leaving nothing standing. "Captain Gerald Whitmore?" Sloan flashed her badge under the fluorescent lights, her voice carrying no warmth whatsoever. "Yes. Agent, please." This was one rogue officer. My department had no idea. "Save it, Captain." The Department of Justice doesn't believe in lone wolves when it comes to a culture of impunity. She turned to address the room, her voice ringing across the bullpen. "As of this moment, this precinct's servers are seized, your dispatch logs are impounded, and every officer on duty during this arrest is confined to quarters pending interrogation. We are also freezing every federal grant this department receives, effective immediately, and initiating a full audit of your military surplus equipment under the 1033 program." Whitmore's mouth opened and closed without sound. His command, built over 6 years on the bedrock of order and control, had been reduced to rubble in under an hour. Meanwhile, Officer Wade Corrigan sat in a sterile interrogation room at the FBI's regional field office, hands no longer cuffed but shaking so violently he had to fold them in his lap to hide it. There were no windows, only a two-way mirror and a single camera blinking red in the corner. The door opened. Vivian Cross walked in beside Agent Sloan. Neither sat down. They stood over him, forcing him to crane his neck upward like a man already sentenced. "Officer Corrigan," Cross began, her voice smooth and edged with venom, "do you understand the federal statutes you violated this morning?" "It was a mistake," Corrigan blurted, his voice a pathetic whine compared to the arrogant sneer he'd worn on Birchwood Lane hours earlier. "It was dark." She looked suspicious. "I was just trying to keep the neighborhood safe." "Safe from what, exactly?" Sloan dropped a thick manila folder onto the table with a definitive thud. "Safe from a woman whose property is worth more than you'll earn in 3 lifetimes." "That's not what this was about. We seized your personal phone, Wade." Sloan opened the folder and slid a printed book across the table. "You thought you were being clever, didn't you? Using an encrypted messaging app to talk to Roger Ashcombe, vice president of the Birchwood Lane Homeowners Association." The blood drained from Corrigan's face entirely. Sloan leaned down, tapping a manicured finger against a highlighted line. 5:15 this morning. "Message from Ashcombe to you. That new woman at 418 is out running again. She's bringing down the property values just by being there. Give her a scare, Wade. Let her know this isn't her kind of town." Cross crossed her arms. "And your reply, 5:18 a.m. Copy that, Roger. I'll make sure she gets the message loud and clear. Might even give her a free ride to the station." The room went dead silent, except for the hum of the air vent which suddenly sounded to Corrigan like the roar of a passing train. "This wasn't a mistake," Sloan said softly, and the softness was somehow more terrifying than a shout. "This was a premeditated conspiracy to deprive a United States citizen of her civil rights on the basis of race, under color of law. That's Title 18, Sections 241 and 242. You colluded with a private citizen to conduct a campaign of racial intimidation against a decorated flag officer of the United States Armed Forces. General Castellan commands logistical operations spanning the globe," Cross added, cold and precise. "She holds a top-secret clearance. And you, a sworn officer of the law, decided to assault and falsely imprison her as a favor to a bigoted homeowners board member who didn't want her on his street. I can explain." Corrigan's voice cracked, tears finally spilling. "Ashcombe promised he'd put in a word for me on a private security contract. I didn't know she was a general. I swear to God, I didn't know." "It wouldn't matter if she stocked shelves at a grocery store," Sloan snapped, disgust plain on her face. "The law protects everyone equally. But because she happens to be a general, you've brought down a level of federal scrutiny you cannot begin to comprehend." She tapped the folder once more. "Your rookie partner is in the next room. He's already given a full statement outlining a pattern of conduct he says he was pressured to go along with for the last several months. In exchange for immunity, he's testifying against you." Corrigan slumped forward, burying his face in trembling hands, a hollow sob tearing loose. His career, his pension, his freedom, all of it had evaporated in the space of 2 hours. The direct and inevitable consequence of a decision made out of nothing more than reflexive, ugly prejudice. Back within the marble corridors of the Pentagon, Brigadier General Naomi Castellan was not weeping. She was working, cleared by the medical team, her bruised wrists photographed and logged for the Justice Department's file. She'd changed into a freshly pressed Class A uniform, the stars on her shoulders catching the overhead light as she walked into Lieutenant General Holloway's briefing room. "Naomi." Holloway stood, a deep scowl carved into his weathered face. "I've read the preliminary DOJ report. It's worse than we thought. Premeditated, coordinated, racially motivated. I read it too, Marcus. She took the seat across from him, her voice level. Disappointing, not surprising. Unchecked authority breeds this kind of rot every time it's left unexamined. The Attorney General is personally overseeing the prosecution, Holloway said. Corrigan's looking at 10 to 15 years federal. Ashcombe was arrested an hour ago on conspiracy charges. Whitmore's being forced to resign by end of day. That resolves the immediate problem. Naomi leaned forward, eyes sharp. It doesn't resolve the systemic one. Meaning? Ridgeview Division is heavily militarized for a suburban precinct, Marcus. While I was in that cell, I took note. Surplus M4 carbines. Body armor, rated for combat deployment. 2 MRAPs acquired through the 1033 program last year. She let that settle. A department that lets its officers hunt joggers, as a personal favor, to a homeowners association, does not possess the discipline, the oversight, or the moral judgment required to hold equipment built for war zones. If they'll treat a woman on a morning run like an enemy combatant, what happens the day they roll an armored vehicle into a peaceful demonstration? Holloway exhaled slowly. You want their toys pulled? I want the department stripped to the studs, she corrected. I'm formally recommending the Defense Logistics Agency recall every piece of surplus military equipment from Ridgeview Division, and I'm requesting a nationwide audit of the entire 1033 program. If local departments want to operate like the military, they answer to the same standard of accountability the military answers to. Since they don't, they lose the privilege. Holloway studied the woman across from him, fiercely composed, methodical even in fury, and allowed himself the faintest trace of a smile. Corrigan hadn't just arrested a general that morning. He'd arrested a master strategist who knew precisely how to dismantle, piece by piece, the very system that had emboldened him. Draft the order, General, Holloway said. You have my full authorization. 9 months later, the summer heat baked the pavement outside the federal courthouse in Alexandria, Virginia. The media frenzy surrounding the Castellan case had built for months and finally reached its breaking point. Inside the air-conditioned courtroom, the tension was thick enough to choke on. Judge Eleanor Voss, known throughout the circuit for showing no mercy in civil rights cases, looked down from the bench. At the defense table sat Wade Corrigan, aged a decade in 9 months, stripped of his badge and his swagger, wearing an ill-fitting gray suit, and staring fixedly at the polished wood in front of him. At the prosecution table sat Vivian Cross alongside a full team from the Department of Justice. In the gallery, seated in her formal dress uniform with quiet, unbroken posture, sat Brigadier General Naomi Castellan. She had declined to give a victim impact statement. She did not see herself as a victim. She saw herself as the catalyst for a correction that had been overdue for years. Mr. Corrigan, Judge Voss's voice rolled through the courtroom, silencing every murmur in the gallery. Please stand. Corrigan rose on legs that visibly trembled. His attorney's hand on his shoulder offered no comfort at all. A federal jury has found you guilty of deprivation of rights under color of law and conspiracy against rights, Voss said, peering over her reading glasses. In my career on this bench, I have rarely witnessed such a blatant, cowardly abuse of public trust. You were given a badge and a firearm to protect your community. Instead, you weaponized both to act as a bigot's hired enforcer for a neighborhood dispute. You targeted a decorated veteran because you decided her presence on that street was somehow a problem to be solved. Corrigan squeezed his eyes shut. A tear slid down his cheek. Your actions destroyed your own future, Voss continued, her voice rising. But they have also cast a long shadow over every honest officer who wears that uniform with integrity intact. Because of what you did, the Ridgeview Division is now operating under a federal consent decree, stripped of its tactical assets and federal funding for a minimum of 5 years. She lifted a stack of papers and squared them against the desk. It is the sentence of this court that you, Wade Corrigan, be remanded to the custody of the Federal Bureau of Prisons for a term of 168 months, 14 years, without possibility of early parole. A gasp tore through the gallery. Corrigan's knees buckled. Only his attorney's grip kept him upright. 14 years, as a former police officer. A sentence that in federal custody carried its own particular kind of terror. Furthermore, Voss added, striking her gavel with a crack that echoed through the room, "You are permanently barred from law enforcement certification anywhere in the United States, and your municipal pension is fully forfeited." Court is adjourned. Federal marshals stepped forward and took Corrigan by the arms. As they turned him toward the exit, his eyes met Naomi Castellan's across the gallery for one final, unbearable second. She offered him no smile, no smirk of satisfaction, only a single cold nod of acknowledgement. The war was finished, and there had never really been a contest. A week later, the first hints of autumn crept back into Thornbury Hills. The oaks along Birchwood Lane were just beginning to turn gold at their edges, and the morning mist hung low and quiet over the lawns. At 5:30, in the stillness before sunrise, Brigadier General Naomi Castellan stepped off her porch in her faded West Point sweatshirt, black leggings, and worn beanie, and began her run. As she rounded the corner, headlights cut gently through the fog. A newly marked Ridgeview Division cruiser rolled toward her, not stalking, not aggressive, just a routine patrol at a measured pace. Naomi kept her stride steady, her breathing even. She didn't brace, she didn't need to. The cruiser slowed as it passed. The young officer behind the wheel, recently transferred into the freshly reformed department, rolled down her window, offered a respectful nod, and gave a small wave. "Morning, General." "Good morning, officer," Naomi replied, her voice calm and unshaken. The cruiser continued on, turning at the corner and disappearing into the dawn. Naomi Castellan kept running, her stride long and unbroken, the weight of justice finally resting where it belonged. Not on her shoulders anymore, but behind her, where it could never again reach forward and touch someone simply for being who they were. It's a sobering thought that a story like that could happen to anyone, anywhere, on any quiet morning. What Naomi Castellan's story really proves is that prejudice hiding behind a badge can unravel an entire life in an instant, both the life it targets and, eventually, the life that wielded it. She never answered violence with violence. She answered it with patience, with precision, and with the full, unstoppable weight of the truth. And sometimes, that is the only weapon powerful enough to take apart a broken system from the inside out.